So good day. I don't know what time you are now. Some of them in the morning, in the afternoon, and the night. It will be a pleasure to start this conference called the Dialectics of Violence and the Extimacies of the Politics, a celebration for the 50 years of Herbert Marcuse's Counterrevolution and Revolt. And may take together this time with you all that are people from two great groups of scholars here. One of them is part of the project Extimacies, Critical Theory from the Global South. That's a project that Surti is the principal investigator of this project with Nadia, Carlos, Alejandro, Sami, and others, and me, myself, too. And the other part, the group of the Marcusian scholars, that is Terry, a great figure in this group, together with Sarah, Robespierre, and others, Lauren Lauman, Andy Lamas, and others, who Peter Irving too. I'm just seeing you here, but let me admit other ones. So it will be the first section. It will be online section. Today's soccer game in the World Cup in Brazil. So it's a way to arrange all this time with you. And this panel will be a good opportunity to introduce ourselves, our groups, and a way to think with these two critical theories or psychoanalytical concepts involved in this meeting, in this conference. Okay, so the first I named this first section "Books and Questions" because the title of Professor Terry Maley will be "Counter-Revolution and Revolt Continues 50 Years Later." I will introduce you, Terry, after this first words. And the second part will be called Extimacy. And the single name, but so complex name to introduce. That will be present by Professor Nadia Ali and Professor Surti Singh too. The first, as I know, you don't know very well yourselves, then I make a short presentation of you. Professor Terry Maley is professor at Politics Department, and he teaches in the Graduate Social and Political Thought. His most recent book is One Dimensional Man, 50 Years On, The Struggles Continues. And the title of this conference is almost the same. It's funny. And he studies intersections between the first generation of Frankfurt School and the radical democracy theory. He teaches at the York University in Canada. So thank you, Terry. And I will introduce Surti and Nadia too. Just a minute here. Nadia is a professor and she is investigator of the project Extimacies, as I said, and she is assistant professor at the Civilization Studies program at the American University of Beirut. She is author of Hall of Mirrors, Psychoanalysis and the Love of Arabic, and her interests revolve around modern Arabic intellectual history, critical theory, and psychoanalysis. And the Surti, just a minute here. She is assistant professor of philosophy of Villanova University. Prior to Villanova, she was assistant professor of philosophy at the American University in Cairo, where she served as principal investigator of the Extimacies project. Her research interests include Frankfurt School critical theory, psychoanalysis, feminist philosophy, phenomenology, and aesthetics. She is also currently serves as the president of the Association for Adorno Studies too. So it will be a nice meeting between psychoanalysts, Adornians, and Marcusians. And I would like to start with Terry Maley, Professor Terry Maley presentation. So you have 30 minutes or around this. Then we can go directly to Professor Nadia and Professor Surti and go for our conversation. I will open the mics for your questions. Okay, so thank you. I would like that you enjoy this time, and let's go to the words.
Okay, there we go. Thanks, Silvio. Can everybody hear me okay? Does that seem to work? Okay, great, good. The technology is working for a change, which in the global capitalist sort of one-dimensional universe of one-dimensional algorithms doesn't, as you know, doesn't always work. But anyway, I'm glad to be here, everybody. Hi to everybody, and thank you, Silvio, and your group for holding this. I think conference. This is, I think, an important and fantastic meeting place for critical theorists of a variety coming from a variety of different traditions and whatnot, but that overlap to meet and talk about and celebrate and update. Nope. Oh, there's somebody else who doesn't have their microphone off, I think. Maybe. Okay, so so thanks for getting everybody together. I really appreciate that, and I also appreciate the remark, of course, about talking at a conference and being with our Adorno colleagues, just as I would about our Frum colleagues and others in the critical theory tent, if you like, the big tent that is critical theory. And I think that especially in this moment, politically, historically, aesthetically, and culturally, that it's really important to get the different strands of first generation critical theory together again, not in an identitarian way, right? not to completely flatten out any as we know, theoretical or philosophical or other differences there might be, which let's admit there have been in the past, but that's okay. I'm more interested in the complementarity of, for example, Marcuse and Frum, or Marcuse and Adorno, and that kind of thing, and the way in which each of their analysis can enrich each other and enrich our common project, if you like, you know, that we can still talk about, I think, to some extent, in terms of both a critique of the given, as Marcuse would say often, and out of that, coming out of that, creating a better world. Or the idea that another world or other worlds are possible, so to speak. So I'm glad to be on a panel with my fellow Adorno scholars as well, and to talk about Counterrevolution and Revolt and the many other issues that I'm sure will come up. What I wanted to do today was to go back and briefly revisit Counterrevolution and Revolt, that's singularly important work of 1972 that Marcuse wrote, of course, at the time, in the context in which it was written, and then to fast forward to the context in which we are today, and to how I think that the book and its key lessons are still relevant and are still with us in a different context. And the short version of my argument is that I think we're now in a new phase of counter-revolution that I call neoliberal despotism. So the missing piece, if you like, that Marcuse was, I think, I argue, and I've argued elsewhere, was just starting to articulate in 1972 in Counter-Revolution and Revolt, was the very beginning of both the mentality and the neoliberal, what came later to be called the neoliberal counter-revolution. And I think he was, as usual, very perceptive in outlining the initial contours of the emergence of neoliberalism that would later begin to come to fruition, of course, the year he died in 1979, 7 years after Counter-Revolution and Revolt. when Margaret Thatcher was elected and then Ronald Reagan, in the world of politics, in other words, when the counter-revolutionary tendencies that he was already talking about actually acquired state power in various places. And of course, there's a different history in the global north and the global south. And that's relevant as well. The history of colonialism and imperialism, I think, comes into play as well, of course, in this discussion and this story, as Roberto Schwartz and many others have talked about, in not only in relation to Marcuse specifically, but in relation to culturally and the developments of neoliberalism and the global economy, or the global political cultural economy, if you like. So what I wanted to start with was this idea that Marcuse described in Counterrevolution and Revolt, the emergence shortly after the 1960s, of course, and around the time of the Watergate hearings in the US and whatnot, the emergence of a kind of proto-fascist syndrome. He described the emergence, in other words, of an authoritarian, what we think of today, of course, as an authoritarian mentality, and various cultural and political and other signs. In 72, he also wrote a piece that I've talked about in my recent work called The Historical Fate of Bourgeois Democracy, which was not published in 1972 because it was written right at the time of the Watergate hearings. And I won't go into that as much today, but the short version of that story is, in The Historical Fate of Bourgeois Democracy, Marcuse talked about how it was that a liberal democracy like the US could turn into something that was not liberal, that was illiberal. In fact, that was, and he also used the term of proto-fascist syndrome in that. He didn't publish that because the Watergate hearings happened and the system seemed to be working. But the tendencies that he talks about in Counter-Revolution and Revolt were at play then, and I think are still at play now in a new and heightened form globally. And that will lead me at the end to make a few brief comments on some of the connections with all of the historical differences that Roberto Schwartz, of course, and many others have talked about between, for example, Brazil and the US, or Brazil and Canada and the US, the global north and south. There are moments of not convergence, but overlap in which similar tendencies, for example, between Trumpism and Bolsonaro, are happening and are occurring. And those are the kinds of things that I think we can get a good sense of, or a kind of grounding in, by looking back at Counter-Revolution and Counter-Revolution and Revolt. So, as mentioned, my argument is that we're in Silvio mentioned the title of my paper, Counter-Revolution and Revolt, still continues. In other words, the counter-revolutionary forces that emerged after the beginning of the disintegration, as Marcuse talked about it in 1972, of the one-dimensional system. In the kinds of things he talked about in One-Dimensional Man, for example, the smooth functioning of the system, the incorporation of the working class, the standardized conformist consumerism, etc. As that was challenged in Marcuse's New Left period, or in the New Left period, and as it began to disintegrate, as it began to come undone in light of protests and under its own weight, the Marcuse says in Counter-Revolution and Revolt that, in fact, the defenders of the system, the defense of the capitalist system, he says, requires the organization of a counter-revolution at home and abroad. It is altogether preventative. In other words, the counter-revolution had no obvious reason. It was just done to prevent further revolution. Here, there is no recent revolution to be undone, and there is none in the offing. There's none on the immediate horizon. Now, of course, one might say today that there's some difference today in the sense that there are numerous, as Loren Langman has shown extensively in his work, protest movements, counter movements, eco movements, etc., against the ongoing counter-revolution. But the counter-revolution that Marcuse began to describe, the attempt to reassert older, more traditional hierarchies of power, to reassert colonial hierarchies, to reassert capitalism, and to reassert control of the production and consumption and construction of subjective identities that willingly engage in their own subordination through the consumption process, through consumerism. That counter-revolution is ongoing, right, is ongoing today. And hence the title 50 years, it continues 50 years later, which is why I think also we can go back to counter-revolution, not completely, it's not the same time and place, of course, but we can go back to it as something of a guide, perhaps not the only one, but as a good guide and a grounding for as a lens through which to look at the moment we're in. So there's no revolution to be undone. Well, there are protests today, but the neoliberal counter-revolution of the past 30 years has also been preventative. The stripping of welfare and labor rights, for example, the aggressive assertion of the rights of capital, and international capital, the increasing and growing inequality that we see, the 1% getting wealthier and wealthier, while large parts of the population become disposable, right, and are more precarious. All of those things are deliberate results, and people often forget this in talking about it. They're deliberate results, at least in the mainstream media, deliberate results of policies that have been consciously enacted and cultivated and nurtured culturally, politically, and economically by the counter-revolutionary forces. The reason I call this current phase, and elsewhere in my work, for example, in an article that I published as part of a special volume on Marcuse in the journal Theory, Culture, and Society just last year, I have a longer list, if you like, of the characteristics of neoliberalism these days. I won't go through that because I think everybody has a sense of what neoliberalism entails or involves. But I think it's involved a shift. I think we're in a new phase of a shift in neoliberalism in a heightened and more extreme form because the symptoms of the disintegration of neoliberal power and legitimacy, which have been under attack also for many years. And by symptoms, I mean Donald Trump and Bolsonaro, right, and others, and Orban in Hungary and Putin and whatnot. The symptomatic manifestations and faces, if you like, of this kind of counter-revolution have now acquired state power, right? And through the acquisition of state power, it's become a much more problematic and dangerous scenario in many ways, and therefore, dialectically, so to speak, much more important for us to keep doing our thing, right? To keep doing our work of critique. Of imminent critique, if you like, of the situation as it is today. In the longer paper of this, I have 3 or 4 different areas that I go over. I won't go over them all, but I give some cultural examples. For example, cultural, economic, political, and social psychological. The cultural examples include things like the Squid Games, this TV series, this South Korean TV series called the Squid Games, in which people are pitted against each other because their situations are so desperate that they're willing to go into a kind of reality TV show in which they can be killed if they don't perform all of the tasks and stunts that they're supposed to, and it's quite brutal, but symptomatic, I think, of the moment we're in culturally. Handmaid's Tale, the Canadian author Margaret Atwood had her book A Handmaid's Tale, which was written in the mid-'80s. In fact, in the mid-1980s, it was a little short novel that became well known in Canada and internationally, but it's been made into a TV series a couple of years ago, and that, of course, is a scenario that describes how the United States descends into another civil war with a faction, a separatist country called Gilead, which is a theocracy, a Puritan fundamentalist, misogynist theocracy that winds up forming itself out of an environmental catastrophe in which the women can't reproduce anymore, right? Women can't reproduce children, and so they kidnap women who can still reproduce them, incarcerate them, torture them, and force them to have kids. And it's ongoing, but that's another sort of symptom of this kind of neoliberal mentality. And what the disintegration, of course, of neoliberalism globally has done is produced a backlash. And it's produced 2 different backlashes. Of course, the movements on the left, so to speak, are a backlash and a reaction to all of that. But it's also produced, as we know, the backlash on the right, the resurgence of traditional hierarchies and traditional norms and values and ways of seeing the world that are, of course, extremely reactionary, as is the case with Bolsonaro and with Trump. So those are, and of course, on top of that, though, there's a one-dimensionality that's still at play in the global entertainment industries and the global entertainment complex. The advertising, the film industry, the TV industry produces endless streams of content on social media, TikTok, etc. That's all one-dimensional. It's very diverse. It's very fragmented for different audiences and markets, but it's all really quite one-dimensional in the way that Marcuse talked about in One-Dimensional Man. Now, behind that, of course, lies the global political economy of neoliberalism, which is which keeps going. And Marcuse said at one point in The Historical Fate of Bourgeois Democracy that, in fact, what he was beginning to see was a moral disintegration, even though the economic machine keeps going. And that's what we're witnessing today, I think, as well. The global economic tendencies, as I see them, in this new phase of neoliberal despotism are, there's a kind of dialectical tension between the heightened precarity of workers in the global economy, and now increasingly in the global north, and disposable people who used to be in the workforce and are now are either being kicked out of it or don't want to be in, right? There's this phenomenon that we heard a lot about during the pandemic in North America called quiet quitting, where people didn't want to go back to work. They didn't want to participate in the kinds of workplaces that Jeff Bezos at Amazon has created, which is a totalitarian, totalizing workplace that Frederick Taylor, the inventor of scientific management, would have been proud of. Increasing computer surveillance, right? Productivity points at work, increasing distance surveillance of workers who are staying at home on computers. All of that is producing a reaction as well, but it's an attempt to recreate a totalizing control of the workplace at the point of production. Politically, of course, neoliberalism has seen the deregulation and cuts to safety nets and the exposure, therefore, of large parts of the population in the way that the counter-revolution intends. Right? Intends. These are conscious, the policies and the policy choices. To be a political scientist for a moment, which was my original training in political science and political theory, all of the neoliberal measures, deregulation, privatization that we saw in Brazil, for example, in Canada and the US over the past number of years, those are all conscious policy choices that the policymakers were aware of the consequences that they would have, right? They were aware of the consequences they would have on working people, for example. And along those lines, they were aware of the trauma that would inflict. I mean, capitalism, ever since Marx, of course, described it, has had a huge degree of trauma and dislocation to go along with it. More so, and in different inflections, of course, in the global South, it always has in the global North to some extent, and it increasingly is again. But the trauma and dislocation and disruption of capitalism has been heightened under this new phase of neoliberal despotism, as I'm calling it, because of the unleashing, because of the very ugly unleashing of what Wendy Brown has described as using Marcuse. In fact, she repurposes or reuses Marcuse's idea of repressive desublimation, not to refer to consumerism, right? But instead, she updates the idea and says, well, in this new environment, where in her book, In the Ruins of Neoliberalism from 2019, where she says we need to bring Marx and Foucault and Marcuse together to do this kind of analysis, where the unleashing of these traditional hierarchies of sexism, patriarchy, aggression, violence, etc., quite consciously has produced an environment where in which the trauma of capitalism and the trauma of neoliberalism has been heightened and extended more broadly to the population at large. And of course, under COVID, we saw that it's led to the exposure and sacrifice of vulnerable or marginal parts of the population. And the sacrifice, by sacrifice, I mean, and there was discussion even in some of the mainstream Canadian newspapers about this, the sacrifice has involved sacrificing, the sacrifice is due rather to the fact that so many services have been cut back. And all of a sudden, even though governments are spending billions of dollars, it had a profound effect on people who are marginal, right, in society. And that was on top of the racism, xenophobia, and other things that have emerged and exploded as part of the counter-revolution, if you like, along the lines that Marcuse was talking about already in 1972. So more broadly, liberal democracy, Marcuse said, which was once a force of progressive historical change, is now turning into something else, right? It's now turning into something that's more authoritarian as a result of this. And as he also noted in Counterrevolution and Revolt and the Historical Fate of Bourgeois Democracy, his concern was that neoliberal fascism, or fascism rather, no longer needs liberal democratic institutions or even liberal values to function. And that is the threat that Bolsonaro and Trump posed, and Orban in Hungary and elsewhere are trying to enact. So the counter-revolutionaries are still pushing very aggressively to turn liberal democracies into illiberal non-democracies, if you like, with all of the cultural and other implications that has. Marcuse argued that in both of these works that it was up to movements, counter movements, rather, on the left to try to create post or non-capitalist institutions, counter institutions, and values that could counter the counter-revolution on the right. And I think that's happening globally. It's not linear, of course. It's not homogeneous. It's not uniform, but it is happening. And I think we are a small part of that. In some ways, our discussions and our teaching, our talking to our students, our appearances publicly and whatnot at conferences like this and elsewhere. But that of course is a struggle. But as my socialist feminist colleague in the UK, Hilary Wainwright, has said, who studied social movements as well as participatory budgeting in Brazil and whatnot in the 2000s, and the insurgencies into the UK Labour Party by Corbyn and in the US by Bernie Sanders into the Democratic Party, that those new forms of revolution, those counter movements and counter institutions are not and don't have to be in the form of one party, one state, one kind of organization, etc. But as Marcuse pointed out in Counterrevolution and Revolt, they can't just be good ideas. There have to be forms of organization and planning attached to them. And one of the things that commentators have pointed out is that the far right that has engaged in this neoliberal counter-revolution for 40 years now, since Marcuse died, has done a lot of planning, it hasn't always worked because their policies are very unpopular and their ideas are very unpopular generally, but they've done a lot of planning and put a lot of money into think tanks, organizations, conferences, etc., funding candidates, a whole range of things, both inside the state and outside the state, that the left also needs to, that the left in its own way also needs to do. It needs to, I think of longer term planning, and it already is, the movements already do that to a great extent, but the longer term planning that's needed to counter that, of course, without the billions of dollars that the far right has, is an ongoing problem that folks have on the left have pointed to in order to counter the counter-revolution. So I'll just get to the end here. That's a bit of an overview and a skim over a longer paper. But what I've tried to do in looking back at counter-revolution and revolt and talking about these new forms of neoliberal despotism is try to look back and retrieve and create, following both Marx, critical theory, and indigenous resurgence and thought in Canada and elsewhere, traditions and values and counter institutions that reflect a holistic social ontology, right? And I think that's what critical theory did. I think that's what Marcuse did behind his critique. There was a holistic social ontology. There's also been, of course, a huge resurgence of Marx, which is not coincidental because he had a similar holistic social ontology that ground his work. So there's implicitly, or not so implicitly, a critique as well of post-structuralism and postmodernism, if you like, postmodern thinking in my work in that sense, because I think it has a fragmenting effect that's in some sense contributes to the disintegration under neoliberalism. But hopefully within this terrain of struggle lie possibilities for creating a kind of ecological, anti-racist, anti-imperialist culture and values and norms, and open-ended socialism that does not have to be defined only by one party or one form of organization or one movement or even one kind of subjectivity exclusively. There are possibilities and cracks in a disintegrating neoliberalism that open up spaces for thinking about new, more holistic, new sensibilities, as Marcuse says. But the long range and planning that are necessary to achieve those, as Marcuse was aware in Counter-Revolution and Revolt, still remain. And so for my last 2 minutes, I wanted just to read something that appeared just last week, exactly along these lines, by a well-known Canadian Indigenous theorist and activist and poet and author named Leanne Betesmoke-Simpson. And she's been an activist and an academic and, as I say, all kinds of things. And she's writing about a land dispute in Northern Ontario, in my province of Ontario, called the Grassy Narrows dispute, which was about logging and mining companies who polluted with mercury the land and the forest and the trees for 30 years. And there's just been and there have been blockades there, et cetera. There have been various kinds of refusals. And there's just been some movement on rectifying that, correcting that 30 years later, because they had a long-term, long-range strategy for fighting back against that. I'll just read this quickly. Over the past 2 decades, what started out as a flashpoint of a response, or a kind of more fragmented response, has transformed into much more than a refusal. In other words, the blockade at the Grassy Narrows Indigenous Reserve in Northern Ontario. This blockade is a generative site where people come together for feasts, drumming, praying, and storytelling. It is a place that holds our dreams for making a world that is grounded in care, enmeshed in the natural world, and designed to bring forth more life. It's a place that reminds me of the struggle to make worlds that refuse exploitation and greed is long and requires commitment, persistence, and sacrifice and planning, she basically says. It is a place that reminds me of whether the blockade is the Wet'suwet'en blockade in BC or the Dakota pipeline blockade in the US or the Anishinaabe. They're all fighting for something that's actually quite simple. The ability to say no to the development in our homelands. In their case, she's from an indigenous tribe. So that we can live in a way that is counter to the forces that have thrust us all into our current climate crisis. So she connects it to the ecology. Yes, anyway, that's the point. What Simpson's offering is just, that's one example of a kind of holistic social ontology that I think has deep affinities. It is not the same as Marcuse, not identical. I wouldn't want to impose Marcuse on Simpson's worldview or vice versa. But it is, there's a deep affinity, I think, on ecologically, politically, culturally, socially, and social psychologically with what Simpson is talking about. So I'm glad that we're able to sort of start this conference off by talking about the different forms of counter-revolution and violence, but also the healing from the traumas inflicted on people globally by the ongoing counter-revolution, and how it can be countered with more holistic visions of reconciliation of a life with nature and with others that is more reconciled than is possible under the new neoliberal despotism. Thanks. That's it.
Thank you, Harry. No, so let's go to the other part of this panel with Professor Nadia and Professor Surti with the title Extimacy.
All right. Thank you so much, Silvio, for having us here. And this is really a great occasion for us to be able to, in a sense, meet at the end of our project. So just for those of you that maybe don't know, it's a project that we've been conducting for the past 4 years. There was a bit of a gap with the pandemic, so we were on hiatus, and now we're sort of, coming back together again. But the project originally started 4 years ago. There's a number of members on the team, and an interesting split between those of us who do early Frankfurt School critical theory, largely Marcuse, Adorno, and Benjamin, and then a number of members that do Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalysis. So the project really became about investigating the links between critical theory and psychoanalysis, but within the context also of thinking about theory between the global north and the global south, because all of us were positioned in the global south at the time that the project started. So a lot going on there, a lot of sort of complex layers. And part of the project that Nadia and I engaged with over the recent years, we had a conference in Beirut right before the pandemic that addressed more directly the concept of extimacy, because we've been mobilizing this concept in a very sort of general way, and a very not loose necessarily, but as a lens by which to think through these broader issues of politics, philosophy, psychoanalysis. But out of this project, Nadia and I had a chance to really reflect on what extimacy is, because it's something that's not mentioned very many times by Lacan. It's definitely, it's a concept or a neologism formed by Jacques Lacan, but not mentioned very much in his corpus. And so Nadia and I had an opportunity to reflect on what extimacy might mean. And we have just finished an edited collection on this concept of extimacy, where we invited authors to think about extimacy in relation to philosophy, politics, psychoanalysis. And she and I co-authored an introduction that deals specifically with extimacy in relation to philosophy and psychoanalysis. So we're going to present some of that today, just to sort of think about how we've come to understand extimacy. So the talk will be a bit theoretical and conceptual, but in a way to maybe also anticipate some of the conversations that are going to be happening later over the next 2 days. Silvio's worked on Lebanon and Marcuse for our collection. I'm sure Carlos's paper will deal with some sort of intersection between psychoanalysis and Marcuse's thought as well. So what we're going to do in the next half an hour is quite theoretical, but just to sort of try to get some kind of outline to what extimacy might be, because it's been so important for our project. And I think Nadia will say a little bit about Marcuse before she talks about her sort of part, which will be more on psychoanalysis, extimacy in the context of Freud and Lacan. So without further ado, I'll begin my part of the talk. Okay, so extimacy is a neologism Jacques Lacan coined in 1960, but mentions no more than 2 or 3 times in his entire work. So extimacy describes an intimate exteriority, or as Lacan himself puts it, quote, the central place as the intimate exteriority or extimacy, that is the thing, end quote. So drawing on Freud, Lacan articulates extimacy as the thing or das Ding, which designates, quote, the excluded interior or what is excluded in the interior. So in this sense, Lacan introduced extimacy to describe a topological zone of unconscious formations that disrupts the binaries inside-outside, essence-appearance, subject, and object. So our claim is that despite the paucity of its occurrence within Lacan's corpus, extimacy does indeed have the status of a concept for Lacan, a concept that is moreover absolutely central to his thought. And in our talk today, we'll thematize this notion through both its philosophical and psychoanalytic dimensions. And this is particularly why this concept was so attractive to us, because of its ability to sort of disrupt these hierarchies of thinking, not only conceptually, but also in the ways that the global North and the global South is often theorized. So Lacan's references to the history of philosophy from the classical tradition to 20th century movements are a fundamental part of his work, presenting the reader with conceptual explorations that illuminate facets of psychoanalytic theory and practice. And the concept of extimacy is no exception. For while it can be directly linked to Freud's psychoanalytic theory and a reformulation of Freud's das Ding, which Nadia will talk about, the working through of the concept can actually be seen throughout Lacan's corpus and his engagement more broadly with philosophy from Plato to Heidegger. And what I found really fascinating in doing this research was more specifically the way in which the rationalist idealist tradition provides what I see as a particularly important philosophical lens for how to think about this kind of aporia that Lacan is describing of something that is more interior than my inmost being. And Lacan, in connection to this, examines notions of memory, consciousness, and innate truths that prefigure the psychoanalytic concept of the unconscious. So in my part today, I'll discuss Lacan's engagement with Plato, Augustine, and Descartes, in whose work I argue we can see this extimate relation, and that for each of them in some specific way, the way that Lacan engages with them, he shows how there lies at the very heart of the subject, in its most interior part, some kind of kernel that is radically other to it, and one that the subject is unable to readily or consciously recognize. So as I'll demonstrate in the following, the confrontation with this extimate kernel at the heart of being requires a startling discovery, namely that what appears to be exterior is actually interior, and what appears to be my most interior self is actually foreign to me. So philosophically, this confrontation raises the question of how this discovery is made, and relatedly, the status of truth and knowledge. So in 1953, Lacan began his second seminar with a reference to Plato's dialogue, the Meno, which had been the subject of Quere's lecture the night before. And the seminar took place after Lacan had been forced to resign from the Psychoanalytic Society in Paris, and at the same time inaugurated his place in the newly formed French Society for Psychoanalysis. So Oliver Harris notes that the subject of teaching and learning, of truth, knowledge, and pedagogy was not surprising, given that Lacan's forced resignation had occurred when controversy over his analytic and training methods had come to a head. So wider questions about the Socratic method and its relevance for psychoanalysis were raised in this seminar. But Lacan's mention of the Meno dialogue and Plato's theory of recollection in particular, I argue, invite questions about this precise extimate structure of truth, which only remain tacit in the seminar, but as I will show or argue, are salient for the way in which Lacan goes on to discuss the analytic ego. So in the Meno, as most of us know, Socrates talks about the existence of an immortal soul that's already filled with knowledge obtained prior to its incarnation in the human being. So lodged in the heart of finite being, in its innermost core, is something exterior and of which there is no awareness, a kind of blind spot. And it's only in response to the paradox posed to Socrates by an exasperated Meno, how will you look for it when you do not know at all what it is, that the theory of recollection leads to the answer. Well, we can search for it because we already partially know it. Right? So in this sense, the human being is a type of vessel or container or space that is filled with knowledge, but whose dimensions do not originate within it. So the innate truths that are the process of recollection, or that the process of recollection or anamnesis will stir up, are inaccessible to the human being. And yet, when one comes across it, one will recognize it or know it. So for Lacan, Plato's theory of recollection, and in particular, Socrates' mathematical demonstration of recollection, tells us something about the pre-analytical notion of the ego. It demonstrates, quote, the function of truth in its nascent state. Indeed, the knowledge to which truth comes to be knotted must actually be endowed with its own inertia, since it exhibits an obvious propensity to misrecognize its own meaning, end quote. So we can ask, how does this misrecognition occur? Right. In the Meno, the search for knowledge is initially understood as a search for something outside of oneself. On the conventional model of learning, knowledge is something external that is taken into oneself, quote, a mechanical model of union and the filling of an empty space, things which are foreign and indifferent to the space itself, end quote. In opposition to this, Plato's Meno presents a view of knowledge in which one traverses their internal terrain in order to find truths that one already knows, but that at the same time one isn't aware that they reside within them, but are guaranteed by this eternal nature of the soul. So the participants of Lacan's seminar debated the extent of the affinity between Socratic questioning and the psychoanalytic practice. But Lacan resisted this parallel, instead drawing attention to the presence of an eternal truth at the heart of the pre-analytic ego that erases the history of its own formation. So for Lacan, it was not a question of how this truth arrived in the soul, but rather only the conviction that it is there, a danger that Lacan posed for the psychoanalytic corpus itself and its tendency to formalize its own concept. So Lacan argued that there's a misrecognition that occurs between two registers demonstrated by the Meno dialogue, between the imaginary and the symbolic. So the knowledge brought to light, given symbolic value, is taken to have been there always, eternally. And yet for Lacan, this occludes the way in this knowledge is brought forth from something constructed out of the imaginary, and turn the way in which there's always something of the symbolic in the imaginary, and also an element that cannot be symbolized, which we could designate the real. So in this sense, the idea of misunderstanding or misrecognition becomes fundamental to psychoanalysis, an idea that can be further tracked from this transition between the pagan and Christian worlds. For Lacan, the centrality of recollection in the Platonic worldview means that, quote, the natural object, the harmonic correspondent of the living being, is recognizable because its outline has already been sketched. And for it to have been sketched, it must already have been within the object, which is going to join itself to it. This is the relation of the dyad, end quote. So with the advent of Christianity, this dyad gives way to a third, sin, which entangles the subject not in recollection, but in repetition and the discourse of the other. So Jacques-Alain Miller locates this extimate relation in Augustine's realization that God is interior into mio mio, that is more interior than my innermost being, whereby the self-evident nature of Platonic eternal truth takes on an uncanny dimension. That is, it becomes a moment of strangeness and therefore also a moment of self-reflection. So in the Platonic worldview, it is never a question that truth resides within the immortal soul, precisely what Lacan's critique was. But in the work of Augustine, the innate idea of God, to be discovered by the reflective subject, opens the strangeness that is at the heart of being, an intimate relation that exceeds the subject. Although God is within the subject cannot know God. Quote, God is found within me, Yet I do not find God because I am outside myself. I am where my mind is, and my mind is where its attention is, and my attention is inveterately, sinfully turned outward, away from both self and God, end quote. For Miller, St. Augustine's formulation that God is interior into mio mio is precisely a religious cover for extimacy. It is a cover insofar as what is most intimate is also the most opaque. That is, quote, paradoxically, the most intimate is not a point of transparency, but rather a point of opacity, end quote. In this sense, quote, God here is thus a word which covers this point of extimacy, end quote. So the figure of extimacy is an exteriority by far more alien to the subject than the external world, which is at the same time more intimate than the subject to itself. So although at times Lacan's reference to das Ding seems to have a kind of transcendent dimension, his notion is ultimately in contradistinction with the plenitude of being signified by God in the metaphysical tradition. With das Ding, the plenitude of divine being is replaced with a void, an emptiness at the heart of being. And Miller's point is that the plenitude of being itself is a cover for this emptiness. So it is in this sense that Lacan locates the presence of the other in the rationalist God, the God that is more interior than my most innermost being, a formulation that also endemic to Lacan's reading of the Cartesian subjects, the last figure that I'll just briefly address. So we see as well in Descartes, as we'll be seeing in Plato and Augustine, that there's this similar extimate relation. So in the first meditation, Descartes rejects knowledge derived from sensory experience as part of this wider rejection of empiricism stemming from the rational distrust of the senses. Yet when he moves further into the skeptical arguments, he poses a fundamental challenge to our a priori beliefs as well, mathematical and geometrical proofs, by considering the possibility of a deceiving God and ultimately an evil demon. So as Lacan emphasizes in the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, Descartes' formulation of the cogito in the second meditation, that unshakable foundation of subjectivity, despite the possibility of universal deception, ultimately requires Descartes to find otherness in God. So although Lacan does not name it as such, we can see here the extimate moment that emerges in his discussion of Descartes' discovery of the cogito. So I'll give a quote. For Descartes, in the initial cogito, what the I think is directed towards, insofar as it lurches into the I am, is a real, but the true remains so much outside that Descartes has to reassure himself of what, if not of an other that is not deceptive, and which shall, into the bargain, guarantee by its very existence the bases of truth, guarantee him that there are in his own objective reason the necessary foundations for the very real, about whose existence he has just reassured himself to find the dimension of truth, end quote. So as Lacan shows, Descartes' discovery of the cogito, the interior certainty that lays the foundation for all subsequent knowledge, is dependent upon that which remains outside, a non-deceiving other. At the same time, the reality of this non-deceiving other can only be established internally, because it is an innate idea, an internal truth that is implanted in the subject, but does not originate from within it. So as Nadia will talk about further, Lacan's reading of Descartes sets the stage for his understanding of the Freudian unconscious. And it is through this specifically dialectical inversion that the extimate kernel, das Ding, comes to light. So for Lacan, there's a convergence between Descartes and Freud, insofar for both certainty is grounded in the subject. However, if Descartes places certainty in the activity of consciousness, for Freud, certainty is in the unconscious. As Lacan notes, Freud addresses the subject in order to say to him the following, which is new: here in the field of the dream, you are at home, end quote. So in finding itself where it was, the subject is called to re-enter himself in the unconscious, a call that is made to a subject of precisely this Cartesian origin. For Lacan, this illustrates the function of recollection or remembrance in psychoanalysis, but it is not recollection in the Platonic sense, that is a return to a supreme and eternal truth. So as Lacan points out, for Freud, this is precisely the essential difference between the structuration of two forms of human experience, one which Lacan, following Kierkegaard, terms ancient and is modeled on recollection, in which there's harmony between the individual and the world of objects that allow for recognition, and the other based on repetition, in which recognition is only ever partial. So with this partial recognition, we also have the introduction of affect, and more precisely the affect of anxiety. As Mladen notes, extimacy, quote, points neither to the interior nor to the exterior, but is located there where the most intimate interiority coincides with the exterior and therefore becomes threatening, provoking horror and anxiety, end quote. So if there's anywhere that the anxiety of the extimate appears in its most uncanny form, it is precisely in this phenomenological relation to the body. Descartes continuously turns to the idea of the automaton as the uncanny union of the mind and the body, wherein the body is something completely independent from the mind, and yet the mind cannot escape its affects. And there is an undeniable dimension of bodily extimacy in Augustine, the uncontrollability of desire or lust, which leads to a deep sense of alienation from one's own bodily functions. And turning to Lacan's Freud, all of these bodily dimensions or relations are codified through this notion of the unconscious, one which interpolates this clumsy duality always through a third, the gap, the hole, the void, that which we circle toward, and yet that which provokes in us the greatest anxiety when it becomes present. And so I'll turn it over to Nadia, who will speak more about this psychoanalytic dimension of extimacy.
Thank you, Surti, and thank you, Terry, for your talk. I mean, it would be good to be able to make some connections with Marcuse. Obviously, I mean, this would have been a great chance to kind of head-on deal with Marcuse's notion of repressive desublimation and kind of the Lacanian account of enjoyment or surplus enjoyment. And perhaps, I suppose, where I will take off from what Surti is saying is to somewhat qualify further why extimacy might be an interesting concept for us to deal with in critical theory, insofar as it helps us kind of revisit the way that psychoanalysis with Marx, right? Freud, Lacan with Marx, or Marcuse's Freud with Marx. The differences, there's obviously lots of differences there, but how this kind of extimate status of the unconscious is crucial for us, or the extimacy or the extimate status of the subject of the unconscious is crucial for us to consider the relationship between nature and culture, sublimation and repression, sublimation and enjoyment. I mean, these are big fundamental terms for us in terms of considering the relevance of psychoanalysis to critical theory and to kind of Marx's critique of the formation of subjectivity in capitalist society. However, this is not kind of technically, part of the paper, but perhaps once I kind of go through what is particular about this kind of Lacanian revisiting of Freud through the notion or concept of extimacy, perhaps this could be something we can bring up in the discussion, right? Because, I mean, obviously there are many differences, or are there many differences? Could there be a way to supplement Marcuse's account of sublimation with a Lacanian conception of enjoyment and subjectivity? Or are they absolutely irreconcilable? I mean, these are things that we really need to consider, especially at this moment where, I mean, as Terry was proposing, that, liberal democracy and kind of somewhat fascism appear to be these, how do you say, perhaps there's something extimate about the nature of authority. This is another question, right, that can allow us to think about how is it that liberal democracy lends itself to kind of this kind of fascistic or grotesque forms of authority? Why is it that this keeps repeating? Right. So these are kind of big questions that perhaps could come up later. But I want to just maybe kind of follow through what Surti was placing Lacan's account of extimacy in kind of the context of a history of philosophy, right? How Lacan takes this figures in philosophy and works through the notion of extimacy or a concept of extimacy using them. And I want to kind of go to what we could call the thing, right? The thing between Freud and Lacan. Right? Because a lot will hinge on how we understand extimacy as a psychoanalytic concept in relationship to the question of subjectivity, to the problem of signification, to the relationship between structure and subject, to larger questions that are ontological, right? So although Lacan coins the term, right, he coins this term extimacy, we could say that it is already predicted in Freud's account of the object. or the object of study of psychoanalysis, the whole object that psychoanalysis is studying. Lacan develops this account of extimacy, or this concept of extimacy, as kind of what describes the interior-exterior relation, primarily through a reformulation of Freud's Nebenmensch, or the neighbor or the fellow human being, as Freud describes it in the 1895 Project for Scientific Psychology. So in Seminar 7, in the Seminar on the Ethics of Psychoanalysis, Lacan focuses on how das Ding, or the thing, emerges for the subject in its experience of the Nebenmensch, or the neighbor, the other, or the fellow human being, as being, to quote from Lacan, by its very nature alien. So examining Lacan's reformulation of das Ding and the Nebenmensch will bring into relief the contours that delimit the concept of extimacy, and furthermore will illustrate the way that extimacy is fundamental to a host of other Lacanian concepts. In the Project for Scientific Psychology, Freud had used the term Nebenmensch to elaborate on the relation between subject and other beyond the kind of paternal function. Freud argued that, and here this is a bit kind of, nitty-gritty of Freud, but it's really very interesting what how Freud formulates this argument. And perhaps, again, the Marcusians with us, maybe some things will light up in this. Freud argued that cognition is a perceptual process, or a complex that involves two components and a disjuncture or a short circuit between them: the subject's relationship to an other as an object, and the subject's relationship to a memory or a wish triggered by the perception of an other, which presents itself in the form of a judgment. Thinking, for Freud, entails the bringing about of a state of identity and a reproduction, quote, of a reproduction of an experience of one's own. So thinking involves a unity of identity, which is represented in the ego, and the judgment of reality through wish fulfillment. So the second moment repeats the perception, or has, to quote from Freud, an imitation value that forms how we perceive the perception. In one instance, the ego organizes the world according to its image, the principle of identity. And in the second instance, something beyond the ego, coming from an outside and arising from one's own body, judges perception, right? So this is the kind of this extimate something, this that comes from an outside and arises from one's own body, that judges the perception. For Freud, the object, or to quote, what we call things, are residues which evade being judged, end of quote. So this object, or the object in Freud's account, is primal in the sense, insofar as it is always re-encountered as that which resists interpretation. And it is in this sense that Lacan's Das Ding returns to Freud's Nebenmensch, or the lost object, as being primary and formative, and that which mediates the relationship between subject and other. And here I just want to kind of, again, make a note, this might be very interesting for us to reconsider or rethink the way Marcuse reads something like primal repression and surplus repression, right? What is really the difference between these, right? Between these two? Because, this is, again, in the discussion, it could be that Marcuse perhaps unwittingly, in this sense here, in this reading of Freud, precisely reconfigures or reestablishes some kind of nature-culture divide, which precisely the notion of extimacy, in the way that Lacan reads Freud here, might be important for us to revisit, as the unconscious as being neither nature nor culture, irreducible to either, but yet somehow generative of both. This is a crucial point here to point to. So it is well known that in his metapsychological works, Freud is quite speculative. Thus, in the Antwerp in particular, he seeks to overcome the divide between, in his days, neurophysiology and psychology, or let's say in our terms, between body and mind. The thought process for Freud revolves around the thing, which, as discussed before, is a complex itself and not some empirical object or real object. Moreover, the effect of reality is produced retroactively in the attempts to cognize das Ding, right? So it's quite complex here. It's not simply a reality principle against pleasure principle as such, right? There's this kind of retroactive attempt, or the feeling of reality, of the effect of reality, is what is reproduced kind of retroactively to cognize a thing that is always not there, right? That is always primarily repressed, right? Always not given at the beginning, always never found for it to be lost, always kind of rediscovered as lost, right? So this account that Freud gives, or this account of practical reason, is one that is guided by unconscious signifiers, right? Because this is what happens in the simultaneously with the generation of this effect of reality, these dreams, memories, hallucinations, mnemic images, and judgments that also provide means of orientation for subjectivity with reference to natural causality, to the so-called biological reality of the organism. So Freud argued that these unconscious mechanisms have what Lacan would deem an extimate status. And the unconscious, or the unconscious, is what revolves around an overlap of multiple losses of this founding negativity and the objects that are always already lost in its place. And Lacan names this overlap objet A, right? I mean, and here again, to point to, this is very interesting to consider in relationship to how can we think about the problem, how does Lacan's concept of objet A, surplus enjoyment, this object of desire, this crucial object in its relationship to surplus, how does it contrast, or how does it differ from Marcuse's account in repressive desublimation, right? What is the difference in between these two things? This is something just to think about, but we'll just kind of, how is extimacy important for us to understand this objet A, right? So since the thing was already a complex object for Freud that is neither empirical nor real, Freud argued that the thing is only discerned through the errors that occur in the course of thought. And to quote from Freud, the beginning of the thought processes, which have ramified from practical thought, is the forming of judgments. The ego arrives at this through a discovery in its organization, through the fact already that Freud, this description that I've already given of Freud, that perceptual cathexis coincide in part with information from one's own body. As a consequence, the perceptual complexes are divided into a constant, non-understood part, which is the thing, and a changing, understandable one, the attribute or movement of the thing. This is Freud. So the thought process complex for Freud always includes the possibility of error, which lies between perception and judgment. And these errors are not simply mistakes of judgment or errors of ignorance, but they are due to a disjuncture between an image and a word representation, what Lacan would call the signifier. It is in this sense that we can say extimacy fuses the apparently contrary meanings of intimacy and exteriority. The extimate is the overlap of this disjunction between an image and a signifier, a mnemic image and a signifier, which produces both a sense of outside reality and interiority. And further to this point, Freud provides us with an account of the ego itself as extimate to the subject. Freud describes this through the process of narcissistic identification as the way in which the ego identifies by morphing itself into an image of its own self. But here the question to be asked, where does this image come from the beginning, right? Where does it originate from? Or better even, how can the ego identify with its image if it's not prior to its image, right? If it's not prior to its image. So the morphing, or the process of identification, doesn't simply retroactively project an image of an ego that was not already there before. It also carries with it, and this is the crucial point for Freud, it also carries with it, it also carries out this projection through a specific desire, right? What Freud would call an original libidinal investment. So the originary anamorphosis, right? This kind of the morphing of the ego into its own image is the moment where there's also a splitting of the ego or a splitting of the subject, right? Whereby the ego is split by its very own image of itself, by what Freud calls this original libidinal investment, or what Lacan would call enjoyment, right? This idea that in Lacan, the moment of the emergence of signification, right, of the signifier, this is coincidental to the emergence of enjoyment. Enjoyment and signification are somehow emerge at once together. And Freud gives an account of this process of narcissistic identification beyond this kind of simplistic psychological understanding of object relations. Right? It's important to say this because, again, Freud with Lacan, or this reading of the emergence of kind of the extimate nature of enjoyment and the way it's kind of stuck to signification, to the kind of the signification of this object that is never to be found, that is always already lost, because it's crucial to point to, because there's so much obviously kind of trauma theory everywhere, or kind of even object relations theory that claim that there's a possibility of the restitution of the object, and somehow this is the way forward. There's some kind of emancipatory potential in this. I mean, this is again a question to be opened up here, right? Because Freud is not precisely giving this account of the object nor the subject, because the subject does not simply internalize an object in the process of identification. Rather, it exhibits a form of what Freud called magical thinking, right? A formative myth of the I, the individual, whereby a belief is developed, and in Freud's words, he says, in the thaumaturgic force of words. A technique is developed for dealing with the external world, right? Love, magic, such other techniques are the means through which the ego develops its sense of interiority and exteriority, for it cannot be assumed to exist as an ego in the individual from the start. So what Freud discovers then is that there's a stimulus which somehow precedes the ego, right? But not in the sense of biological stimulus, right? A constitutive discord, perhaps we can think about it, and an originary anxiety, a constitutive anxiety, a privation that somehow transforms or is sublimated into a demand to be loved and to be desired, right? This idea of that Freud already introduces what we could call here kind of a repression that is before repression, right? And I'm kind of pointing to this more because the sense I have is that this complicates the way we can read Marcuse's account of repression, for instance, in contrast. So it is based on such observations and a consistent return to them that Freud developed his concept of the drive, right, of Trieb, as that which is irreducible to the struggle between life and death, right? The kind of the caricature, right? This the struggle between the death drive and the life drive, as though there's two drives, right? Or the struggle between the pleasure principle and the reality principle. So, but as the implicit surplus of desire that is generated from this recurring epic duel between reality and pleasure, right? So this is a very important point here, that the idea of the concept of the drive and the way that it's linked to this question of enjoyment or privation, right, from the beginning. And this is a crucial point, the surplus element of desire that is generated in this so-called epic duel, right, between the reality principle and the pleasure principle. So the drive here is not simply a will to death or a will to dying, but a pulsating negativity that is propelled from the resistance of desire to itself. So what Freud, Lacan, or this kind of understanding, psychoanalytic understanding points to is that there is an economy that emerges from the impasse of desire, an economy of surplus that lends itself to itself, repeats in its pulsation, but not as a vital force, right? Not à la Deleuze, although there are a lot of similarities but crucial differences, nor simply as a negating force, but as that which repeats what is, to quote here from Alenka Zupančič, what is impossible to be repeated. And this impossible, right, that repeats is accompanied by enjoyment, by jouissance, which captures the subject through the chain of signifiers. As Lacan puts it, the psychoanalytic understanding of the subject can be stated most fundamentally as follows, and to quote from Lacan, and this is a really crucial quote, man primarily demands to be deprived of something real, end of quote. So in this specific seminar that Lacan discusses this in the ethics of psychoanalysis, Lacan returns to Freud to argue that this primary demand to be deprived of something real, right? A demand that precedes its own repression, a repression before repression, is what coincides with the primary symbolization, with the emergence of signification. So in a sense, sorry, this is, there was a kind of feedback. In a sense, the symbolic or culture is born out of the pangs of the real, whereby the whole problem of extimacy, of the subject and the real, is contained in this gift of love and this kind of magical belief in the power of words and all this. So there's no room here to enter into the details of Lacan's discussion of the problem of love, which he spends quite some time on the discussion of the medieval troubadours, the poetic sublimation of the narcissistic wounds of subjectivity, right? This courtly love for a lady that can never be attained, the sublimation of the thing into the lady into the thing, right? And it's very clear, although in this discussion, that Lacan says that, you know, sublimation and not repression in poetry and art posit an object of love, of identification, as generally a terrifying, inhuman one that cannot be begotten, right? And this is, again, you know, something to note here. Again, how does this account of, because what Lacan basically says in the seminar on the ethics, and just to point to this here, he says this in the 1970s, that in a certain sense, sublimation as we've known it is over. Right, there's something different. There's now no longer this kind of sublimation that is in this form that we have in this kind of medieval troubadours. But now what we have is enjoyment. It's almost like at some point Lacan says something like sublimation is no more. Right, this is something crucial to kind of take account of here. So what is crucial in Lacan's elaboration of extimacy is that it is a concept that captures a relation between subject and reality that has a very particular order. It is not mimetic. There is no mimesis anywhere here, even in the very image of the ego itself. So this morphing of the ego that is always generating a surplus, the ego as being nothing but this measure between the object and the idea of the object. There's no direct correspondence or equivalence between the so-called object and reality and the object inside, right? Or the thing, as Freud has called it. The lost object, or this demand for privation, is not equivalent to an internal object, but is transformed into a symbolic object for it to be loved, for it to be for there to be a relation to it, right? In other words, it is transformed into a signifier. So this idea that the signifier emerges to cover this kind of a privation, this demand for privation, this non-relation between subject and object. And it's at precisely the site of its emergence of signification that enjoyment is also what is present, right? So the love relation, for instance, or the ideological love relation, I don't know, the love of the nation, the love of family, the love of so on, is always a satisfaction of power by way of sublimating this originary demand for privation in a chain of signifiers or in a form of communication or in a discourse. Right? So culture, or the symbolic, is what we create as a divergence from, a holding back from this extimate thing, right? And as Lacan enigmatically puts it, it is as though for the subject, to quote, even before I is born, the aims of the I appear, end of quote. Even before I is born, before sublimation, there is already an image. So courtly love, the example that Lacan gives of this form of sublimation that we no longer have somehow. We were no longer able to, the task of psychoanalysis is to somehow put that back into work. That sublimation is no more in a certain sense. Courtly love, or the idealization of the lady who is anything but a real woman of flesh and blood, is not simply an act of sublimation, but reveals an impulse or a compulsion for sublimation that somehow precedes sublimation, or this is how Lacan reads it. Put differently, there's a sublimation for satisfaction that has always already been missing. And the problem for Lacan is what's happening, this is in the 1970s, we could say this is coincidental to, you know, the rise of neoliberalism, as well as that. The problem is that there's no longer a place for this so-called missing satisfaction, right? This is the problem. This is what's happening. There's now, what is there is surplus enjoyment. There's enjoyment in a certain sense unchained. So Lacan's intervention into subject-object relations is crucial here. For the subject is always traversed by an object, and an object can never be fully integrated into subjective knowledge. So subject-object relations are only adequate in this sense, or can only be understood at the level of fantasy. And all fantasies are sustained by this missing element, a lacking element that cannot enter the frame of fantasy, lest it shatters it, and so on and so forth. And again, here, this question to be opened up, to be considered. I mean, the fantasies that kind of sustain political authority, right? Has something changed in the structure of fantasy itself? When we say there are grotesque forms of authority, there are obscene forms of authority, Modi, Bolsonaro, Trump, all these examples, right? Or, is there something else happening in these mechanisms of authority that is different, or has it always been like this? I mean, these are the kind of questions that this kind of proposition, this kind of approach might open up. And what Lacan designates, or what he points to, is that this missing element, right? This element that is never in the frame of the fantasy, but that is, that is necessary for, the idea that the subject can only relate to the other via the detour of an object, right? This objet, this object of that is always this missing object that even when it is encountered as something that has already been lost, right? This is the kind of the mechanisms of desire, right, or of enjoyment. And what is crucial to say here is that this object again is nothing that is kind of it's not scopic, right? It's not something that that can be somehow seen. It is an object that occupies a place only to reveal that it has been empty from the start. So in this sense, objet A, or in Lacan's account, is correlative of the subject. It is extimate to it, because it reflects and objectifies the subject as an unknown, which prompts the pursuit of further knowledge on the side of the subject, right? This excitation that happens, right? This enjoyment that happens in the pursuit of knowledge of this missing object, right? This is kind of the path of subjectivity, right, in the psychoanalytic account. So in other words, the object is this blind spot in the fantasy frame, the element which cannot be included. It is neither symbolic nor is it imaginary, but it somehow signals for Lacan, or the proposition that Lacan introduces here, is this element of the real. It is something, the objet A has an existence, but it has no essence, right? Through a complex dialectic of proximity and distance, objet A supports seeing. It is both intimate and exterior to the seeing subject, that is, to the gaze. So the more the subject seeks a knowledge of their desire in the other, the more the subject realizes their alienation in the symbolic, and the greater the need for a separation, a face-off with this negative element that sustains fantasy. And negativity is precisely what propels this extimate relation to the object. Right. So, I mean, from the context of the clinical setting in psychoanalysis, in the psychoanalytic clinic, the position of the analyst, or the discourse of the analyst, or the discourse of psychoanalysis occupies this objet A, right? It occupies the place of objet A, and it is precisely, the kind of the task, the aim is to expose the subject to the mode of enjoyment, to the modes of interpretation of reality in which they are already implicated. So it's no longer possible to sustain a belief in this object, in the objet. So this jouissance, or this enjoyment that is what is meant to be exposed by the analytic procedure, is, in many ways a result of a love relation, right? An ideological interpolation through which the subject comes to identify itself, insofar as the subject corresponded to a lack in the other, to this problem of lack and desire. So most importantly, then, this objet A, or this object of surplus enjoyment, the elusive object of desire, is one of Lacan's major theoretical contributions, which would be unthinkable without extimacy as the concept of the relation between subject and structure. Extimacy then indicates neither an object nor a subject. It is also not a concept that implies predication. The word, however, can be employed to describe the non-relation between subject and object. The subject is extimate to structure, Objet A is an extimate object that anchors the subject's kind of unconscious desire, the so-called ferret, right, that the analyst seeks to sniff out like a dog. This is kind of Lacan's image here. And so what's crucial here is that the psychoanalytic understanding of subjectivity and otherness, the relation or non-relation between them, hinges on the extimacy that is marked by objet A. And so the only object of study of psychoanalysis, this excessive element which persists and presents itself in desire. Objet A is both a remainder and lack at once, the lack upon which structure pivots. And why is this crucial? Because objet A distinguishes psychoanalysis from structuralism, which largely understood subjectivity as a product of structure, also from post-structuralism, and this is crucial, which proceeds from the dismissal of the category of the subject as incorrigibly humanist, from Foucault's death of the subject to various recuperation through a social ontology of subjectivity with, I don't know, say gender theory or something. So the non-relation marked by objet A poses a serious question to any relational ontology that proceeds from the recuperation of the subjective through intersubjective relations. Even if this intersubjectivity is understood as the becoming other to oneself, that's still not enough. In other words, objet A, as that which signifies the real, poses serious challenges to theories of recognition that remain within the field of the symbolic, raising the question, how does a subject recuperate a reconfigured relation to the big other? How does this work? From here, it becomes crucial to think about this question of the non-relation. This is a crucial problem in psychoanalysis, how to think about the non-relation as this cut that is kind of there between subjectivity and otherness, subject and object. What's crucial here is that to point to this idea that there is this non-relation is this kind of cut, is a cut in the thing in itself, right? From Freud to Lacan to so on. It's this kind of inherent impossibility in every possibility. And this is a crucial point to take into consideration, that this inherent impossibility in every possibility is what is always kind of retroactively repeated in kind of repetitions in the failures to remember, that are part of memory itself, the failure to find again something that we have already lost. This idea that Lacan says to repeat is to not find the same thing again. And it is the real, right? This category that Lacan introduces that marks an inherent contradiction or impossibility in ontology. And it is at this point precisely where the subject emerges in the gaps or lacks in structure. And one could say here, and this is kind of, I'm really at the end here, that the site of emergence of the subject is precisely there in this extimate place. This idea that Lacan proposes, the subject is always extimate to structure. There's an extimacy between the subject and the structure. From the cracks in structure, from the gaps of its incompleteness, from this, what we could perhaps name this kind of rift that can be located at this extimate encounter between enjoyment and signification. And this is why, in a certain sense, we could open up here this problem. I mean, this could perhaps help us link to this the problem between or the distinctions or the contrast between this account of enjoyment and desublimation or repressive desublimation, for instance, as an example. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Nadia. So we can open the mic now for questions, and if you wanted to write to the chat, it's okay too. We can read if you have any problems. But as a meeting, online meeting, it's better to listen ourselves. If you don't have any question, I would like to start the first one, because Terry, Nadia, and Surti made me to think about a word that's very important for Marcuse. And maybe it's not, it's a kind of estimate concept in this discussion. Terry talks a lot about the ontology, talks a lot about reconciliation, and so on and so on. And that's a problem for Nadia, I believe. And but in the same time, I don't know if this reconciliation is a kind of identification. Maybe it's not. There is a kind of a struggle between nature and culture, a kind of struggle between death and life, and so on and so on. So when I read Marcuse's books, I believe that this reconciliation is not a kind of identification, but it's another thing. We can think more better, and I believe that this conference will be helpful to think better about this. So that's an interesting point, because we talk about ontologies, we talk about politics too, and in the same time we are talking about different ways to think, maybe the challenges of the society today, how to create a relation without a kind of colonization of the other, or another, or disappearing of the desire, or so on and so on. So I don't know if it's a question, but it's interesting to listen more about this, maybe. Here there is another in the chat, sorry. And Andrew Lamas, if you want to open your mic, Andrew. No?
I have too many children in the background, so I just wrote it out for you.
Okay. Two questions. The neoliberal period is often discussed in North America and Europe, beginning with Thatcher and Reagan. Others, including Silvio, have argued that we should look earlier to US-backed 1964 military coup in Brazil as a commencement moment. Thoughts? And the second question, left theorists have often viewed the revolution and counter-revolution dynamic as a call and response, with revolution rising and then failing due to counter-revolutionary backlash. Do you think of Trotsky's permanent revolution concept and Marcuse's preventive counter-revolution concept and his thoughts on prefiguration as challenging the way we think about the relation between revolution and counter-revolution? Two big questions. A new one. Lauren has two.
Should I just go ahead?
Okay, Lauren. Then we finish it with Lauren, then we can return it for the Peter has another one. Your mic is moved.
Yeah.
Okay now? Yeah, the people that know me know that I have a number of perhaps psychopathologies, one of which is optimism. I think I note that, although there's no quarrel whatsoever with much of what Terry is saying, and much of my own work has been on the right wing in the last several, at least for the last 10 years. But there was also the progressives that Terry did mention. And let me just use two blatant examples. One, maybe three. What just happened in Brazil with Lula barely coming back, but there is that reaction against Bolsonaro. As we just saw in the United States, that the red wave that was supposed to bring all sorts of horrible mega people back into power or give them more power, it didn't happen. Something that I don't know if it's really covered very well in the news, but yesterday the Iranian mullahs or ayatollahs decided to end the morality police in face of this massive protest throughout the entire country, led by women. I think it's important to note that this was a feminist movement. And so I do see that there's a counter reaction, and this has to do with the increasing things that Terry did mention, the growing number of the left, and the consequences, the adversities of neoliberalism have been such as to foster a left response, a right response that would restore a country or nation or time that never existed, versus the left response to restore a better society. And in my own work, I've basically said, and if the left doesn't succeed, our planet is fried and there's no jobs on a dead planet. The other question I have is toward Nadia. And this was one of the problems that I found throughout the work of primarily Freud and Marcuse. And maybe this is a little bit too esoteric question for this discussion, but this is very, very solipsistic. And this was, not particularly tied to relationships. And I can find this very much, clearly in Marcuse's notion of desublimation. It's a very individualistic thing, and desublimation, that, even when he talks about desublimation, repressive desublimation of sexuality, there is no other. It's not like there's no there, but there's no other there. And as you were going through it, which I very much enjoyed it, given my own particular background, having gone through psychoanalytic training, I was originally going to be a shrink. There's no sense of connection with other objects. And as you were talking, I was constantly thinking of that whole object relations tradition of Winnicott, Bowlby, et cetera, et cetera. And so I wonder where otherness of other objects really ties into the position that you were taking. And since I talked too much, I'll stop now.
If you can answer.
Do you want me to start? Sorry, thanks for all the points. I mean, from Silvio's to the last point. And I guess, obviously this is, I have some questions myself as well, but I think the problem in terms of the issue that I think I'm trying to propose here is that the Lacanian account of extimacy, or the particular reading that Lacan gives of the unconscious, or in a certain sense, the way that he revisits Freud and insists on this concept that we've built a whole, research project around, and we're arguing might be important for us to consider in relationship to all these, the reemergence of so many of these, how would one put it, binaries in a non-dialectical manner, right? I wouldn't say that the way Marcuse thinks about nature and culture is the same as the way that nature and culture are considered in theories of restitution or reconciliation, there's a lot to be done there. Marcuse is surely a dialectical thinker. However, as I suggested, there might be a place where precisely in this distinction between basic repression and surplus repression, that perhaps unwittingly he resmuggles in a category of nature that already, as a dialectician himself, nature is already denatured for Marcuse, but yet somehow there in this particular reading of Freud, it opens a question. What is this nature? What is this harmony? It's as though he makes this distinction between, basic repression is almost, there's something more harmonious about it versus kind of surplus repression and the progress of civilization. And I think this is a problem. I don't have an answer to it in Marcuse. Obviously, I tried to provide a line for thinking about this with Lacan, in the sense that proposing that the way that Lacan introduces this object of desire, this object of enjoyment, which surely, the engagement with it is absolutely solipsistic, right? There's no question about that in the analytic process, right? But only perhaps for that to somehow come to an end. And yet, yes, that is a singular problem. It is a singular individual answer, although the place of this emergence of subjectivity can be arguably universal, blah, blah, blah. We can go on with this forever. How does this translate into a political project? I would say it's a question for militants to ask, not necessarily analysts as such to answer, right? What psychoanalysis can offer to the discourse of militants is militants can decide what they take and what they do not take from it in terms of political organization, in terms of, you think about the problem of authority and kind of, revolutionary action, in terms of what you define as what is a revolutionary subject, what is it really connected to, what is the desire that is driving it, what kind of, these are questions, that obviously psychoanalysis does not have answer to from the position of psychoanalysis itself, right? This is the problem of the political, right? But however, one can say that the moment of the social movements, the global 1960s, because we know it's not only happening in Europe, it's happening everywhere else in the Arab world, in Lebanon, where I'm talking from, in all kinds of places, right? Where there's this warning, let's say, that Lacan makes, just beware that this kind of getting rid of repression, assuming that getting rid of repression and this kind of freeing of sexuality, all this stuff, this is perhaps not the way forward for emancipatory action. We can see today this is no longer debatable. We know that this has failed. We know that this has led us to very limited places, right? So, I mean, here it is interesting to consider what Lacan is proposing, or the way that Lacan is approaching this problem. But that's, I mean, I'll just, I don't know, I'll stop there. I don't want to talk for too long. There was, I think maybe this might address a few of the comments that were raised. Yeah.
I see another hand up there. Go ahead, and I'll respond to Andy's remarks and Nadia's comment in a minute if there's time.
And there is a question from Peter Irving too about the Heideggerian perspective.
Okay, yeah.
But Carlos, go ahead.
Thank you for the conferences, and also the comments that are in the chat. There's a super interesting question on the origin of neoliberalism, and regarding that point, tomorrow I will talk about, in my opinion, it's super interesting that the beginning of the neoliberalism coincides, at least in Latin America, with a new kind of emancipation movements, which is Salvador Allende's election, and also the coup d'etat. We can discuss that tomorrow, because this could be one of the contributions from the global South. But I just want to recuperate what Surti and Nadia said regarding the importance of Lacan, not only in Extimacies project, but also for a kind of renovation, a possible renovation of the Freudian left, including, of course, Marcuse. Because why it's important to read psychoanalysis now, and why Lacan? Because it seems very strange that why a weird guy that is very complex to express himself like Lacan, it's important to read by somebody that is interested in politics and militancy. But it's the same question as we can that we could ask regarding Benjamin or Adorno or Marcuse, because why, if we are in the middle of a huge problem of Nazism, why do we have to read Freud, which is a weird guy that it produces strange theories about pulsion, death instincts, these kind of things? I think this is the question today, and in my opinion, what Nadia and Surti said, I just want to extract two things, or maybe more, but what Surti said is very important, because there's a philosophical background in Lacan, and the philosophical background, for me, one of the most important, at least of what Surti said today, is Alexander Kojève. Because the question is, what is the impasse or the novelty of modernity? So that's why, in my opinion, Lacan is just the consequences of a philosophical reading of Kojève. For Kojève, there's a rupture between the pre-modern world and the modern world. And what Lacan is doing is reading all the consequences of modernity, of philosophical modernity, but for clinics. And that's why it's super interesting, this point. And regarding Nadia's conference, it's if we want to make which are the points of contact between Marcuse and Lacan, she puts one point of contact which is very important, the relationship between surplus and original repression, which is super interesting. But I would say that not only for Marcuse, but also for all the Frankfurt School, which are the points of contact? For me, there are at least two. One is negativity. I wouldn't say that there's a conception of dialectics in Lacan, but at least we have the concept of negativity. And the second point is, and this is important for the questions, it's the tricky ways of counter-revolution, which are related to psychic mechanism. But especially of one point that Surti mentioned today is it's because in Lacan there's a super interesting point between, the point is not the opposition between essence and appearance, but the point of existence, which is a very Hegelian and Heideggerian point, but it's not in a philosophical speculative way. But if we don't tackle down this question, we can't explain these tricky ways of counter-revolution. And yeah, that's my point. And thank you for the conferences.
We have some questions from Peter. Peter, one more specific, Peter Janssen, that makes a more specific one about the main the lectures, Nadia's and Surti's lectures. Reminds him in Heidegger's terms of science, Vergessenheit, which is just focused in the lonely man. And the second one from Peter, how can individual desires explain what a society keeps together in general, helps to build up a universal desire of a non-violent society? How can individual desires can be transferred to a common goal of freedom? What is a manipulated desire needs? And this follows his questions, and he's very interested in the concept of extimacies. He appreciates I particularly appreciate your inquiries because I assume you will remain concerned, as we were the first generation Frankfurt scholars, about the obstacles to the formation of revolutionary consciousness, and that therefore we need to search for researches in the radical insights of psychology, social psychology, and psychoanalysis. How can we know the beyond capitalism that we have not yet experienced and are even blocked from imagining? Do we even need to know what we want, or do we only knowledge of it by working to negate that which we, in solidarity with others, with solidarity being, in a sense, the ultimate relation, politically speaking? Refuse in the here and now. Is it appropriate to say that we can partially know this beyond capitalism, a socialism that obviously we do not fully grasp through prefigurative, but allows constantly the generation, creations, and the continuation? For example, a contemporary communing, radical pedagogical praxis, philosophy as a negation. Are these questions relevant to the insights generated by concept of extimacies, or is the concept focused on other political questions? I believe that's it will be the last round for answer, and if you want to follow.
Well, if Sylvia, if I could just jump in for a second, I think there's a very interesting discussion going on as well in the, and thanks for the papers, by the way, the two papers, they were very interesting. I have to admit, not things that I thought of right away because I was sort of in my Marcuse zone, if you like, and not specifically back in Eros and Civilization and the psychoanalytic dynamics and discussion in Marcuse. But if I can just respond briefly to Andy and then the point about surplus and basic repression that I think Nadia raised. Andy, I think you're right, and I agree with Carlos as well, that it was almost unconsciously on my part a kind of global North American view when I said, I was talking about neoliberalism having begun. It, of course, began in the Mont Pelerin Society in the 40s, in the 50s after the Second World War, and it was applied, if you like, in Pinochet's Chile and then in terms of neoliberal economic policies being enacted under the guise of a military dictatorship. And then, of course, in 1964 in Brazil. So absolutely. So the counter-revolution, of course, I think that's an important question or comment that Andy made, because the counter-revolution has different faces, if you like, and different modalities of, and the counter-revolution in the global North that I talked about with regard to Reagan and Thatcher and the past 30 years is very different, in many ways similar. It has some overlap, of course, in terms of economic policies, but it's very different in terms of the politics, the use of violence, etc., in terms of how it manifested itself in Brazil and then in Pinochet's Chile and in Latin America. With regard to Andy's second point, so I take that point, absolutely. With regard to the second point about permanent revolution, I think that's a very interesting question, Andy, because I think what's become apparent through various studies like the historian at Duke University, Nancy MacLean, in her study of the long game of neoliberalism by an economist named James Buchanan, who was an ally and minor colleague, if you like, a lesser known colleague of Milton Friedman, is that the counter-revolutionary forces of the far right have been engaged in this kind of almost permanent counter-revolution, if you like. I think that's what Andy's comment made me think of. And yet the left, in some ways, the sort of, even the ecology movement, which might be the closest thing to a universal movement that we have globally now, in addition perhaps now to Me Too and Black Lives Matter, but the ecology movement's been around for longer. It's become more permanent, but not in the same way, not with the same consistency, funding, organization, etc., that the right-wing movements have had, that the counter-revolution has had. So that's an important question, I think, Andy, that you're raising, and that is the social movements globally are not as coherent and well-funded and well-organized or organized in the same way that the movements of the right have been continuously, and now we're seeing the results of the continuous organization of the movements on the right. So I think there's an interesting discussion there about permanent revolution to be had, and that idea, Andy, exactly as you mentioned, is needs to be rethought somehow, if possible. If it's within the limits of the possible to rethink that on the left, it needs to rethink that. Now that it links, I think, in very interesting ways to the discussion of Surti and Nadia, and it leads me, Nadia, to the question of, you mentioned the distinction after your towards the end of your comments about in Marcuse between basic and surplus repression. And it leads to the question of, well, do you have to buy into what some might see, of course, as Marcuse's more foundationalist or essentialist view of libidinal drives? And what would, when he makes that distinction between basic and surplus repression, he assumes, of course, that surplus repression is the cultural, economic, social, and political layers of repression that most regimes, historically, including capitalism, including monopoly capitalism in his day, or neoliberalism now, he would probably say, layer on top of the organism, if you like, and that we internalize. And it leads to the question of, on Marcuse's analysis, or in an analysis of Lacan, where there are more gaps and there are more, there's a different configuration, if you like, between basic repression and what might be seen as surplus repression. What would basic repression under socialism, for example, look like? What would basic repression under if there's some kind of basic repression that's needed for society to function? I think that would look very different, for example, for Leanne Simpson and for indigenous resurgence theory and indigenous communities than it would for Marcuse. But that's a very interesting question that your talk has led me to think of. What would basic repression, or Marcuse's category of basic repression, look like? In light of perhaps both a discussion or a dialogue with Lacan, let's say, on the one hand, and in terms of a socialism or socialisms. Maybe there isn't just one kind of socialism, socialisms that have inflections in the global north and south, different national inflections, different cultural inflections. What would that look like? And I think the quote that I read from Leanne Simpson at the end gives some sense of a holistic community that includes symbolic meanings, right? That includes symbolism and symbolic meanings and a relationship with nature. And I think this was a critical point that you mentioned, I think, as well, a relationship that nature that isn't just a blind identification, right? That isn't just an automatic somehow identification. So when Leanne Simpson says she wants to reconcile with nature, or she wants Indigenous people want to live with nature, what does that mean? Just an identification? I don't think so. I don't think it means just that. It's not limited to that. And that's an active, ongoing process that is reproduced self-consciously in contradistinction to and against the destruction of nature under capitalism, right? Under neoliberal capitalism in a sense. So I think that's a very interesting question that's opened up. I can't answer it fully right off the top of my head just now, but I think that would be a very interesting exploration or re-exploration of Marcuse, along with what I'm referring to as maybe parallel or affinity-based conceptions of holistic ontologies, if you like. And so if ontology isn't possible, if ontology isn't possible for Lacan, perhaps, I guess one of my questions would be, what is the ground? Is there any foundation, any sense of foundation? Because you don't, of course, want foundations to be closed or to be enclosing or to be terminal in the sense of closing off other possibilities. And it goes back to that question that Rosa Luxemburg asked many years ago. That I remember the scholar Norman Gerard asking a long time ago when he wrote a paper in the 90s on Luxemburg. And he said, well, if Luxemburg's idea of spontaneous revolution is supposed to end somehow in socialism, then where does that spontaneity go? Or what does socialism mean? And to that, I think the response is there need to be different, perhaps different formulations based loosely on a kind of something like an open-ended ontology, perhaps, right? Not closed, but an open-ended ontology, so that there can be different kinds of organization, different parties, different ways of reaching or realizing something like socialism that don't have to be identical in a way, that don't have to end in one form or one kind of party or one kind of state or one kind of subjectivity, or something like that. So thanks for that. You made me think of those questions in a new light.
So I can take up some of the questions, and I know that Nadia and Sammy want to say something related as well, but maybe I'll start off. So this question that Andy posed about the sort of ban on images, the block to utopian thinking or thinking beyond capitalism. So, I mean, I work on Adorno. So of course there is this idea, this like sort of ban on images, this inability to conceptualize what the future would look like. And I think this has opened up lots of problems and interesting questions in terms of politics, and what has also created a kind of dialogue for me with Nadia in terms of thinking about Adorno and Lacan together. Adorno always being accused of being apolitical or preventing a kind of praxis, and Lacan, as you mentioned, as being almost solipsistic and not having this relationship, to objects. So, what might be the value of returning to these figures in order to think through these harder problems of this kind of ban on images? And for me, the crucial political question really becomes one of subjectivity, which is why this is also, the psychoanalytic point of view is really interesting to me, because as soon as we pose this question, right, of how do we think beyond capitalism, what do we want? Right. And this really brings up problems of intentionality, for example, right. And ideas of desire, of instinct, of the unconscious, because in both Lacan and Adorno, we can't take the same subject for granted, right. And this is always the problem of politics. Like, how can we just sort of fix our imagination? How can we think about action in a better way, but we're not really thinking through the subject and this kind of decapitated, debilitated subject as a result of modernity and all the problems of modernity. So really, the very idea of the imagination needs to be rethought, right? And this is where the resources of psychoanalysis, but also phenomenology, become extremely interesting and important to me, especially also the sort of critique of intentionality, and really how the imagination even isn't just a personal thing, but also a social thing, right? And how current society of the spectacle, let's say, of the images, what that does to the imagination, how that sort of decapitates the imagination, but also produces this kind of new possibility that we have to think through for the 20th century. So there are these old problems and problematics that need to be sort of defined according to our contemporary political moment that has, of course, changed. And so this is really like why I think, there needs to be almost like a dual perspective, right? Because we can't fully abandon questions of praxis or politics, but we also can't abandon this kind of inquiry into the subject that can't act, right? That is sort of this kind of fragmented, depoliticized, subject. So I think both need to be happening at the same time. And this is why sort of this project of bringing together Frankfurt School critical theory with psychoanalysis is so crucial and so important, at least in the way that I see it. And maybe I'll let Sammy say something about the specific question of desire. Right?
No, maybe a footnote. Hi, everyone. Thanks for amazing papers and the comments. It's maybe just a side note to the idea of rethinking political imagination that probably would not end in images or in like bad images in terms of representations that could already be commodified. So if Marcuse is right with this argument around end of utopia, then, I mean, the old idea, the Marxist idea of utopia would be that the capitalist relations of productions point in their very non-identity beyond what they are. So they're non-identical. So capitalism doesn't need intellectuals to come up with some kind of utopia, because the utopia is already there, because the situation points beyond what capitalism has realized. But if I get his argument right, then Marcuse would say we would be in an end of utopia because we can realize everything already. So the thing is there. So basically that there is this kind of actualization of technology that other ages or other generations of critical theory could still say capitalism is on the way to enabling that. So what does that mean for what others have theorized as capitalist realism, that imagination is not enabled to point beyond it? But I think you made it clear. Benjamin would offer, of course, as an idea of political imagination as image as presentation, as some kind of flashlight that would not crystallize in an image that you can, represent and ban. But maybe something I say something about this in the next days. However, utopia, post-utopia thinking is also to this degree a good thing, because at least there's not the idea that utopian consciousness is an insertion of extra consciousness that somebody knows more. It's not a question of episteme. No? Right. Oh. Nadia, I go on desire. I think you are better equipped. I just have to close a window here.
I'll just make a brief comment about the question that's asked, and maybe again to kind of try to bring the various comments together. Thanks, Terry, for the points you brought up, and how to, what is, and here I would think, what is Marx's ecology, right? Rather than, I think that the question is whether we're tasked to come up with a new concept of nature, or to actually comprehend what was Marx's ecology in his account of, the capitalist, the ecology of capital, like what was Marx's counter ecology? What was the problem that Marx was introducing, right? And that's precisely, in a certain sense, the whole point, and obviously there's no need to kind of say much about this because, you're all familiar with, the Freudo-Marxist moment. The idea was that what Marx described and what happens in kind of the fetishistic relations of capital, this kind of practices that are based on kind of belief, and, this belief and this kind of, how do you say, the kind of the value of the thing, right? What is in the object, right? That they're not simply relations premised on need. That's this kind of ideological obfuscation, right? There's a production of desire. This is what Marx says in his critique, in that section, let's say, of commodity fetishism, right? And the whole point here is that, I think there was a point about need and desire. The problem is that is being suggested, or what is this kind of incomplete ontology, or this problem of incompleteness, or the ontological question in Lacan and Freud, perhaps, and perhaps similar to in many ways to Marx's account as well, as this idea that in the place of the so-called fulfillments of needs, something emerges that is not need, that is of a different kind of problem of satisfaction, the problem of desire, right? How does desire get produced at the site of satisfaction of needs? I mean, if we cannot answer, how do you say, the mechanisms, the discourses through which this happens, and through which they actually have changed, let's say, from the 1930s till today, or what kind of cycles that these mechanisms or discourses go through, right? Then we're a bit, how do you say, we have no, we're still far off from actually developing and what is an account that is kind of critical, or kind of that can negate this process. So I just wanted to say this here, that that we have to think about ontology as incomplete. We have to understand the incompleteness, the problem of incompleteness ontologically, this problem, let's say in psychoanalysis, of being and enjoyment, and problem of signification for us to consider. I mean, the problem isn't that how do we create a desire for revolution? The problem is, how can we have a signifier that brings together, why is it so hard to produce a signifier today that kind of brings together, solidifies some kind of universal movement together? There's no proper, master signifier that can bring all these, you describe all these different struggles, all these different problems. Underdevelopment is from the beginning. How do you say, uneven development is from the beginning of capitalism, right? It's nothing new, right? So how do you bring together, what is the new signifier that is going to bring all this revolutionary potential or possibility forward? This is the question. And perhaps why are the old signifiers not working anymore? I mean, this is something to also consider. But I'll stop here. Sorry, I don't know if I went off the track here. And thank you, just suggesting that the problem of desire is always, crucially psychoanalytically speaking, desire is never individual desire. This is how the question was, the problem of Marx. How does psychoanalysis link to Marx? Desire is never individual. Desire is always the desire of the other. It's always collective. The unconscious is not individual. The whole point here is that the ego is not a master in its own house, right? The I is not in its, the subject is not the I. This is the whole kind of discussion that I was proposing in terms of Freud's account of the ego itself. So, desire is never an individual desire. It's always the desire of the other that you have come to enjoy without knowing. And the whole point is, in the analytic process, is to recognize, this is not really my enjoyment. What do I really want? What do I really desire? That is perhaps the hardest question, right? This kind of, that opens up, perhaps a destitution of subjectivity, a recognition that, I lack the very answer to this question. There's this formative negativity that there are all these ways to disavow it, right? To disavow my originary castration, all these ways that I develop, right? All these mechanisms that I hinge into, but then it's all premised on this disavowal of castration. So, these things have to be, we have to consider sublimation, we have to reconsider castration, we have to, the proposition is in light of Lacan's revisiting of Freud, which is happening, simultaneously to the Freudo-Marxist moment, but perhaps going in different directions. Maybe, as Carlos says, because of just one misreading of Hegel, also Marcuse also knows Hegel with Heidegger, right? But then you have, Kojève knows a certain Hegel. I don't know. These are things we have to consider. That's the, yeah.
We have a new Marcusian here.
Yes, a new.
But Terry and Carlos raised their hands. If you want to take the word now for fast words.
Sure, I'll be quick, but go ahead, Carlos.
Just one remark. Yes, Nadia is correct when she's pointing out that society is not it's not only collective. It's for Lacan, desire is desire of the other, means at least three elements, and that's why Surti's remark on this shift from the structure of truth between a dyad to the triad, it's super important, there are very interesting things on how Lacan is thinking in a triad way, not only imaginary, real, and symbolic, but also how he thinks society as a collective, not as a group of individuals, but as a collective. You can find that in the logical time, or in the text that is called the number 13 and the logic of suspicious. There you can find that the structure of collective, not society, but collective, is at least 3, which is super important. That is to mean that there's no individuals, there's no collection, there's no group of individuals, and that prevents us of thinking psychologization as something, as an exterior and an interior in kind of a topological sphere. But this is why triadic structure of thinking in Lacan is related to extimacy, as Nadia and Surti just remarked.
And Sylvia, if I could just ask a last quick question. Surti, I'm glad you mentioned Adorno at the end there in your comment a minute ago, because in these notions, it made me think in these notions of reconciliation or paying attention to the object in terms of, however one might configure the subject-object relationship. In Adorno, there's an emphasis, of course, in negative dialectics and elsewhere on the primacy of the orange subject and object, the essay subject and object, on the primacy of the object. And I think that was, I think in that remark I saw, or that aspect of his thinking, I see a kind of attempt to recover the distinctness and autonomy of objects in some measure in light of the one-dimensional society, right? The one-dimensional economy, culture, and society, and psychology, social psychology, that was prevalent, of course, that he saw in Nazism and afterwards, and the Marcuse saw in One-Dimensional Man and that kind of thing. And so, if I guess what I'm struggling with or grappling with is that if you pay attention to the primacy of the object in Adorno's sense, that doesn't necessarily mean, for me at least, I think, identity thinking, right? In fact, Adorno was opposed to, he was against that, right? He argued against identity thinking. And so I'm just curious about if you treat, for example, nature or others or the collectivity as both non-identical, and you pay attention again to the primacy of the object instead of simply incorporating all potential symbolic and other objects into yourself narcissistically in a way, then where does that leave us? And where does the account of Lacan sit with Adorno's idea of the primacy of the object? In other words, paying attention to the distinctive, unique nature of the object world in some sense. So it's just a question that I had after your very interesting presentations.
Yeah, no, I think this is such an important question, and it requires a lot of explanation. I think part of what Adorno, I think there's a misreading of Adorno, right? That there's this kind of materialism, and then we just sort of contact, like a tactile almost contact with some object, right? And it's almost like abandoning our conceptual frameworks and returning somehow to the thing itself, which of course Adorno is not saying. And it's definitely not this identitarian relation with the object either, right? So I think there's very interesting, this is, a related concept would be the idea of how Adorno reworks the metaphysical tradition in order to think about the non-identical, right? Because there's something always excessive about the object that allows for a non-identitarian relationship with the object. So the primacy of the object is never about also just subsuming oneself to the object, because there will always be something that exceeds one's conceptual categories. Mm-hmm. So it's really about rethinking what that object is in its dimensions, which again, I find the psychoanalytic route really helpful, because it complicates this idea, right, of what is a subject-object relation. So, but there's so much more to say about that. But yeah, I appreciate that comment.
Mm-hmm. And that it's multidimensional. All objects are but they're both multidimensional, even if they have or share commonalities culturally or otherwise, which they have to do by definition, because it's as Carlos was saying, it's a common project. It's a collective, right? We are all the collectivity in some sense, but we have that sort of distinctiveness at the same time that isn't completely distinct.
I mean, even the category of failure becomes so important, right, for Adorno, because actually it's the failure to grasp the object that produces something in excess of it as well, right? So there's all these sort of related categories as well that, and then become important for praxis as well. This idea of failure, of error, of incompleteness, you know. So
yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, there are fireworks around her. I don't know if you can hear it. In Brazil, we have this sound now, because we are commemorating the first panel we have now, not the soccer game here. And we are very happy to join this group of interesting scholars here. It will be important to advise you that we will have another chance in the Wednesday at night in Brazil. I will send you the link for the conference, Paulo Arantes conference. He will be a great critical theory, great Adornian too, or maybe Marcusian, I don't know. And it will be very nice to have you at that night. I will send you all the information if you want to stay with us. It will be a little, it will be night in Brazil, maybe in Lebanon will be very night, but we will record too. Thank you, Nadia, for your words, Surti and Terry, and congratulations for our
thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
So football, yeah.
Thanks, everybody. A wonderful conversation.
Bye-bye.
Bye.